Hello, everyone. Warm welcome. Thank you for joining us virtually and in person here in Bangkok at this side event, managing the risk of a temperature overshoot in the Pacific, in the Asia Pacific, the roles, if any, of carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. This side event is co-organized by the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, and the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G. My name is Qi Zheng. I'm the outreach officer with C2G. It's my honor to chair the session today. So the agenda of the event is as follows. We'll start with the opening remarks, and then which will be followed by keynote speeches. And then we will have a moderated panel session and a Q&A with the audience. So without overdue, I would like to invite Mr. Kaveh Zahedi, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNESCAP. Mr. Zahedi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure, dear Janos, Ambassador IJ, and fellow panelist Shin, and colleagues. Oleg, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event. I guess it's going to be an intimate conversation more than anything else, and in a way, maybe the recent COP and what the Secretary General said at the COP actually provides the perfect backdrop to our conversation today, because he said, and I quote, "We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing, global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible." End quote. I think that basically is the backdrop for our conversation today. Even before that, we saw a whole slew of UN reports as heading into COP that painted a pretty grim picture of where the world stands today, right? WMO confirmed that atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide all reached new record highs in 2021. UNEP's emission gap report made clear that the window for 1.5 degrees is closing fast. The UNFCCC, in their report, showed that the current national climate commitments in the NDCs are basically falling pitifully short of what is needed to keep temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And our own assessment at ESCAP actually reconfirmed that. Just looking at the NDCs from our region, it looks like GHG emissions are set to rise by about 15 or 16% by 2030, rather than heading in the opposite direction. And all of this, of course, we know the consequences, and we're already seeing them. This human-induced climate change is causing widespread disruption and affecting the lives of millions of people, billions of people. In a way, the floods in Pakistan this year that have inundated a third of the that have inundated about a third of the country and impacted more than 30 million people, have given us a glimpse into our potential future climate reality. And countries are obviously going to face increased, overlapping, cascading shocks and crises. And once more, the signs are that climate change and its impacts are somehow going to be magnified in certain parts of our region of Asia Pacific. In other words, going beyond global averages when it comes to temperature anomalies, when it comes to the loss of high mountain glaciers, like in the Hindu Kush, when it comes to heat content and sea level rise, as it affects the Pacific and Indian Oceans. So in a way, we have reached a stage where the hope of keeping temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, and indeed the net zero aspirations of countries, is going to likely require some sort of negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal. Now, how can our region move towards this? Well, a lot of countries are banking to some degree on nature-based solutions as a potential. We've seen movement in this direction: Cambodia, Indonesia, here in Thailand, looking at land use and forestry. But frankly, attaining the targets of nature-based solutions is going to depend also on quite a big step change in terms of technical feasibility, in terms of ambition, in terms of economic feasibility, and of turning what is currently actually a high emission sector into a carbon sink. At the same time, there's growing interest in technology-based solutions for carbon dioxide removal, including direct air capture. But of course, again, these are at the very, very beginning, and what they offer are frankly a drop in the ocean. We saw similar conversations on big techno fixes in the carbon capture and storage, which has taken decades. It's another one of those technologies that has long been part of our climate discussions, but has consistently fallen short of what was hoped. So this is in a way, Janos, the backdrop, right? The context for our conversation today on carbon dioxide removal, and indeed on solar radiation modification, and whether it has a role in managing this risk of the temperature overshoot. To be honest with you, I mean, to some of us, even talking about this, it feels like defeat, right? It feels like defeat because of where we've come from, right? The decades of fighting a quite hard battle against the changing climate. But I guess the harsh reality is that the trend of global heating, the trend in GHG emissions, obliges us to explore all the possible means to avoid, frankly, a catastrophic future, right? And so we look forward in that context to hearing the conversation, to sharing in the conversation today, and at the end of the day, you know, to trying to help as our region navigates its options for securing essentially a livable future. So that would be, I think, for us, or for me and for UNESCAP, the backdrop for this conversation today.
Thank you, Mr. Zahedi. Now I would like to invite Dr. Wiban Dawan, the Director General of the Energy and Resource Institute, TERI, to deliver the opening remarks. She's Dr. Dawan, she's connecting from New Delhi. Please, Dr. Dawan.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Mr. Kaveh Zahedi, Deputy Executive Secretary, UNESCAP, distinguished panelists and participants. In partnership with the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, that commonly called C2G, TERI is very happy to co-organize at the 7th session of the Committee on Environment and Development this UNESCAP side event titled Managing the Risk of Temperature Overshoot in the Asia Pacific, the roles, if any, of carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. Now, very rightly mentioned that the temperature overshoot, which is appearing more and more likely, and that perhaps it's our defeat so far, the 1.5 degree centigrade goal becoming very difficult to abide by. And it is definitely asking for newer approaches that will look for solutions. Indeed, most low temperature pathways presented in the IPCC special report on 1.5 degree rely on a huge expansion of bioenergy use, and with subsequent carbon capture and storage or a massive afforestation program to extract atmospheric carbon dioxide. But do we really have the land? Can we really do it? So these are questions yet to be answered. And some of these techniques, while they are focusing on removing CO2 from the atmosphere, recycling it and determining safe and permanent storage options. But as I said, that time will tell us how practical those solutions are. And we are still some distance away from broad commercial adoption of safe underground CO2 storage options as well. Considering this, it's becoming that we need to seek techniques that seek to cool the earth through solar radiation management, or SRM. Such SRM approaches do not affect the quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, yet seek to reduce global temperatures. While not really a solution. It provides a sort of breathing space to undertake needed decarbonization. SRM appears cheaper and thus more appealing to some compared to further reducing GHG emissions or using carbon dioxide removal methods. But it arouses controversy as it has a huge and unclear risks associated with its potential impact on crops, weather conditions, drought, biodiversity, and so on. And also likely uneven sub-regional and regional impacts. It may well also prove to be detrimental for some regions and some communities, especially those in the global south who are already confronted by the burden of tackling the climate change challenge. Such issues would no doubt be explored in today's panel discussion. Against this background, TERI annually organizes the World Sustainable Development Summit, and in fact, it will be the 22nd session in February next year. And this is the largest annual gathering on sustainable development issues hosted anywhere in the global south. This year, WSTS is from 22nd to 24th of February 23 in New Delhi. And after 2-year gap, this year will be a hybrid mode because I'm sure many participants would be able to attend in person. And given the growing and highlighted relevance of this topic, TERI and C2G would be taking our partnership forward by convening a thematic track on science and governance of climate altering technologies at WSTS 23 session. We hope that discussions at such events would enhance awareness of the latest scientific and governance developments pertaining to large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management and the risks associated and concerns. And I'm sure because even discussions over there with larger gathering will give us what are the questions asked and what are the fears in the mind of people and develop the research agenda forward. I wish today's panelists and participants to have fruitful discussions and outcomes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Darwin. We look forward to continuing working with TERI colleagues to advance discussions on these challenging issues. Now, I would like to move on and start the keynote sessions. We will have 2 keynote speakers. First of all, I would like to invite Ms. Chen Tsring, the Director of UNEP Asia and the Pacific Office, who will talk about the key messages from the latest UNEP emissions gap report and the adaptation gap report. Unfortunately, Dr. Tsring cannot join us in person, but she pre-recorded video. So can colleague play the video, please?
Distinguished delegates, dear participants, I would like to thank the Energy and Resources Institute and the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative for inviting me to share key findings of the Emission Gap Report and the Adaptation Gap Report and a perspective from the Asia-Pacific region. The international scientific community has reached a consensus that global net human-caused emissions, anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, need to fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 in order to reach net zero around 2050 and to keep the world within a 1.5 degrees centigrade increase, which will help prevent the worst climate damage. Parties to the UNFCCC Convention collectively agreed to work to reduce the gap between existing emission reduction plans and the actual reductions required to limit temperature rise compared to pre-industrial levels. But our current policies and measures are far off from this emission trajectory in order to limit temperature rise. Policies currently in place without further strengthening, UNEP's emission gap report suggests a 2.8 degrees centigrade increase. If we implement all nationally determined contributions plus a net zero commitment, it suggests an increase of 1.8 degrees centigrade. But this is not considered a credible scenario due to discrepancy between current emissions, near-term NDC targets, and long-term net zero targets. Globally unconditional and conditional nationally determined contributions estimate to reduce global emissions in 2030 by 5% and 10% respectively, if we compare emissions based on policies currently in place. National climate pledges under the Paris Agreement also point towards global warming of 2.4 to 2.6 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. In 2022, a review of climate emission in the Asia-Pacific of the Asia-Pacific region was developed by UNESCAP, UNEP, and UNICEF, and this was under the issue-based coalition on raising climate ambition on climate action. And here it's revealed that even if we implement all nationally determined contributions completely, our emissions will still be 16% higher than what is required to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. This report recommends that we align nationally determined contributions with long-term, low-emissions development strategies, and we develop and implement deep decarbonization sectoral pathways for energy, transport, urban development, trade and investment, and we utilize new forms of technology and innovation, and we invest in nature-based solutions. Distinguished participants, on the adaptation side, the UN Secretary General says the Adaptation Gap report makes it very clear the world is failing to protect people from the here and now impacts of the climate crises. We're already seeing the devastating impacts of flooding in South Asia, vicious summer heat across the northern hemisphere. The suffering we're seeing only at just 1.1 degrees temperature rise. Our region, Asia Pacific, is home to 60% of the world's population, a third of global GDP, and it would require significant investment to protect our people and economies. Hundreds of millions of our people live in coastal cities threatened by rising sea level rise. So before I end, I would like to stress that countries in Asia and the Pacific need expedited energy transition. We need to move away from coal as fast as possible, as the region still emits 50% of global emissions, and we need to be supported by technology and finance. I thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chen Sring. Now I would like to invite Mr. Andy Riesinger to give the second keynote about how to situate carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification in the context of the global climate crisis and the temperature overshoot. Mr. Riesinger is connecting from New Zealand, and he's a member of the Bureau of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and is also the vice chair of the Working Group 3 report of the 6th assessment. And he's also serving as one of the 8 commissioners on the New Zealand Climate Change Commission. Please, Andy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chi, and hello, everybody. It's great to be with you, at least virtually. I feel humbled by the very insightful introductory remarks that almost make my contribution obsolete, but I will still try and take you through a few slides that I put together, and just want to thank both TERI and the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative to invite me and to contribute to this side event. I'll just try and share my slides. And I'd also like to acknowledge a number of inputs that I received from various IPCC authors, bureau members, and technical support units. I would like to stress that any mistakes or judgments in the slides in my presentation are entirely mine. So I'll try very quickly cover what is CDR and what is it good for, what is overshoot and how is CDR relevant to this, what is SRM, solar radiation modification, and how could it complement mitigation, and lead out with some concluding thoughts on challenges, opportunities around governance issues. So a key conclusion from the IPCC 6th assessment report is that limiting human-induced global warming to a specific level requires limiting cumulative CO2 emissions, reaching at least net zero CO2 emissions, along with strong reductions in other greenhouse gas emissions. And that is, of course, simply a result of physical science. There's no political distribution or commitment in that. This is simply what the science tells us must happen. As you're probably all well aware, global warming, which is shown on the vertical axis here, is strongly linearly correlated with cumulative CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution. And so it's simply a case of the more CO2 we emit, the more we warm the world. And it is a necessary consequence that net zero CO2 emissions are necessary to halt global warming. We simply have to stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Out of that flows, of course, the reverse, that if we want to reverse global warming, we have to actively reverse global CO2 emissions. Because of the long lifetime in the atmosphere, they don't disappear by themselves. We have to actively take them out of the atmosphere. Which leads us to the role of CDR. And a key conclusion from Working Group 3 is that the deployment of CDR, of carbon dioxide removal, to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. And let me just illustrate the unavoidability of that. What you see is a stylized pathway of global CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions in orange. And of course, that is always composed of a combination of gross CO2 emissions and counterbalanced to some extent of total carbon dioxide removal. So at the point of net zero CO2 emissions, it is inevitable that there has to be some amount of CDR applied if we want to get to net zero. And that applies both at country level and at global level, simply because we have no feasible pathway at this point to completely avoid all gross CO2 emissions. So even just reaching net zero CO2 makes the deployment of CDR unavoidable. The only question is, how large is the scale of CDR? And that's driven by how far can we reduce our gross CO2 emissions. But there are very, very few pathways that outline a way to reaching zero gross CO2 emissions. And that makes CDR a necessity, even just to reach net zero CO2 emissions and to halt the continued global warming. Of course, then looking further into the future, we might want to achieve net negative CO2 emissions in order to achieve, for example, net zero greenhouse gas emissions and to achieve declining global temperature, which by and large will imply increased amounts of CDR because of the ongoing assumed residual gross CO2 emissions that need to be counterbalanced by a greater amount of CDR. Now, the IPCC has undertaken a very detailed, comprehensive assessment of a wide range of CDR options. I'm not going to go through them in detail. I would just like to point you to Working Group 3, Chapter 12 provides an overview, but equally Working Group 1 from a physical science perspective in Chapter 5. So it's a comprehensive assessment of the potentials of sustainability, of constraints, of risks and co-benefits, and especially at large scales as well. There's also discussion about the methodologies for monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon flows. Maybe 2 points that may be relevant for our discussion today is that currently afforestation and reforestation are the only mature methods that are widely practiced. But there's a wide range of methods that are either proven in their component parts or demonstrated at very small scales. And as was already mentioned, the key challenge will lie in how can we upscale that. Another tension arises from the fact that biological carbon storage is of course always vulnerable to reversal, either by climate change or by practice changes. But biological carbon storage also has the largest potential for co-benefits if managed well. So these are important trade-offs and risks that need to be addressed by governance issues that we may want to discuss further. Now, on overshoot, and as already pointed out, it feels like defeat. It is a conversation that we must have in order to navigate our way forward. In the IPCC definition employed in the AR6 report, overshoot pathways are pathways that first exceed a specified concentration relative to forcing or global warming level, and then return to or below that level again before the end of a specified period of time, often before the year 2100. And this has been used in close alignment with that in the Working Group 2 assessment that looked at the risks of overshoot, but also in the global emission scenarios assessed by IPCC Working Group 3, in particular, 2 scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, but category 1 achieves that with no or limited overshoot, generally by about up to 0.1 degrees Celsius overshoot for several decades, whereas category 2 implies higher overshoot of between 0.1 and 0.3 degrees Celsius typically. So just very quickly looking at what does it mean to overshoot and what does it mean for emissions. Here's a number of illustrative pathways that don't all limit warming to 1.5 degrees in the long run, that just illustrate different amounts of overshoot, different durations of overshoot, and different levels of overshoot. So the blue pathway is what's commonly called a 1.5 degree pathway with no or limited overshoot. The orange pathway does not limit global warming to 1.5 degrees until well into the 22nd century and has a very high overshoot. And then the green pathway is a more thought experiment pathway with a very, very high overshoot during the 21st century that would still reduce global warming to close to 1.5 degrees during the 22nd century. These are just illustrative pathways based out of physical model studies. I'm not saying that they're relevant for policymaking at this point. They're important to clarify concepts used in conversations around overshoot. Now, the important point to look at in terms of overshoots that can be described in terms of the magnitude of overshoot as well as the duration. And the key drivers of overshoot, keeping in mind that overshoot is both the exceedance and then decline of temperatures. The critical requirements, as I said before, are net zero CO2 emissions, at which point the warming stops by and large, and then achieving net negative CO2 emissions. And of course, the lower the overshoot, the more rapid near-term emission reductions are needed. Vice versa, high overshoot relies on large-scale net negative CO2 emissions in the long term. I just want to add that the rate of non-CO2 emissions, especially of short-lived climate forces, is also relevant for overshoot for 2 reasons. One is the rate of non-CO2 emissions adds to the warming from CO2 at peak level, but also a continued decline in short-lived climate force emissions could support a further decline in global temperature. So it's predominantly driven by CO2, but non-CO2 emissions are relevant. And of course, depending on country profile, may be particularly relevant for that country's contribution, but also mitigation options. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about risk, but only very briefly. You'll be well familiar with the burning embers diagrams, which are used by the IPCC to communicate key high-level risks associated with different levels of global warming. And at the global level, there's sort of 5 key embers that cover unique and threatened systems, extreme weather events, the distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, and large-scale singular events. It's important to understand that those embers and the literature on which they are based predominantly have assessed how risks increase with warming. What we're trying to confront in the context of an overshoot conversation is, to what extent does the same relationship apply in a cooling world? To what extent does cooling then reduce those risks? And just very briefly, for one thing, we have to recognize that risks are a combination of climate hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And it's the confluence of those 3 that determine the extent to which those risks are indeed reversible if we manage to reverse the global temperature trend. As far as unique and threatened systems are concerned, for example, once species are extinct, once ecosystems have been rendered incapable of continued functioning, reducing temperature is very unlikely to bring them back. That's a simple fact. As far as extreme weather events are concerned, of course, for example, the frequency of heat waves would expect to drop down again, but that neither brings back the people who were affected by heat waves and by extreme flooding events during the period of overshoot, but also those events in the past may have changed the vulnerability and the adaptive capacity of communities, which means that the risks in a climate where temperature is reduced again may not be the same as the risks were before the climate started to exceed a given threshold. And then in other areas, for example, global aggregate impacts, sea level rise is one of the key risks that drives coastal hazards and impacts, where, of course, reducing overshoot will still have continued sea level rise because we would have to reduce temperature far below the levels that are envisaged, even in the Paris Agreement, if we want to stop sea level rise from occurring. I'll leave it there for the risks. Very briefly, moving on to solar radiation modification. This is often proposed as what's called peak shaving. So if we have a set of pathways, the red line would be climate impacts or temperature as a proxy under business as usual. If we cut emissions aggressively, we might halt the rise in temperature. If we add large-scale CO2 removal, we might be able to reverse temperature again. And then the question arises, could what's also called solar geoengineering help shave off the risks associated with this temporary peak in temperature? That's where I think the relevant conversation about solar radiation modification lies, because if we do not actually have a peak and decline pathway based on emissions, we are committing ourselves to solar radiation modification in perpetuity in ways that would magnify risks associated with it. There's been a fair bit of attention given in the IPCC assessment, both in working groups 1 and 2, and also from the governance side by working group 3, on various ways of solar radiation modification. And I guess the key messages out of that, rapidly condensed by me into a single slide here, is that there is a wide range of possible or proposed interventions. They have different mechanisms, they have different scale, and as a consequence, they would have very different impacts on global, regional, and seasonal climate, both in terms of temperature and non-temperature aspects such as rainfall, depending on their deployment. And that is a very important point. For example, stratospheric aerosol interventions could be deployed such that they mimic the temperature effect of reducing CO2 emissions, but that would require aerosol injections at multiple places in sort of a staggered way around the globe, whereas a single aerosol injection would not achieve a mirroring of the effects on temperature or other climate variables of carbon dioxide removal, for example. But then, of course, those different effects also have different impacts on non-climate aspects such as land and ocean, ecosystem productivity, crop yields, sea salt deposition, biodiversity, and of course, none of those would stop ocean acidification. A concern in that goes back to the deployment of solar radiation modification as peak shaving is termination effects. If we were to stop solar radiation modification after having deployed it, we would expect a rapid increase in global and regional temperatures and associated impacts. So that's the reason why peak shaving is most likely to be manageable in terms of its risks, because there would be a softer landing on the assumption that the global response to climate change in terms of emission reductions would allow such a soft landing and such a gradual exit strategy from solar radiation modification. But overall, we do have low confidence in our understanding. And I need to emphasize, this is all based on stylized model scenarios of deployment. Very few of those have actively considered likely geopolitical drivers that might lead to non-coordinated deployment of solar radiation modification. And just to illustrate, in 2 maps on the right-hand side shows maps of how much different interventions that have the same effect on global average temperature might affect precipitation patterns from stratospheric sulfate aerosols and marine cloud brightening, where you can see that the impact on rainfall in different regions of the world would be quite different, even though the effect on global average temperature would be the same. So that just illustrates the regional diversity of different solar radiation modification approaches. Very brief concluding slide. I'd really want to leave you with the message that CDR is essential for even just reaching net zero targets for holding temperature. And for that, it's critical that we upscale and develop MRV methods, robust policy mechanisms to deal with impermanence and reversal, especially on the side of biological carbon storage, integration of CDR into mitigation portfolios rather than treating them as a poor cousin. I think CDR is really an essential component of mitigation, and we cannot achieve our stated goals without working towards CDR. Of course, there are risks from large-scale deployment, but I would put to the distinguished audience that these risks are not unique to CDR. There are risks from large-scale mitigation of any nature. There are risks from large-scale deployment of hydrogen as an energy carrier. So areas where CDR presents unique risks are particularly in the area of transfer of biomass, where one country might be supplying biomass for the carbon capture and storage as part of bioenergy, for example, in another country, and the consequences that might have on the sustainability, on food security in that country, which then requires particular governance mechanisms. But by and large, I think risk from CDR are at national and subnational scales, depending on their deployment. CDR is equally essential for achieving overshoot, i.e. for achieving a sustained decline in global temperature after a peak to reach net negative emissions, where the scale required of CDR depends crucially on both the remaining gross emissions that we need to overcompensate and the intended rate of decline. So there's a number of moving parts here. They're not givens out of just saying net negative emissions. But of course, there would be an added dimension to global burden sharing once we reach a state of net negative emissions, but also domestic policy design, because you run out of polluters to pay for carbon dioxide removal. So that requires a different framing, a different role of governments to achieve net negative emissions. On CDR, on SRM, I think it's pretty clear and widely agreed that SRM can complement but not substitute for mitigation. It's particularly effective in the context of a limited overshoot. But limited overshoot in itself relies on a functioning global cooperation to achieve net negative global greenhouse CO2 emissions in order to achieve the peak and decline in temperature in the absence of solar radiation modification, which allows a gradual exit strategy. There's clearly high risks from unilateral deployment, given transboundary impacts and non-uniform responses to SRM, whereas managed and manageable risks, again, rely on functioning global and regional cooperation to design interventions properly. And just as a last thought, when we talk about risks and benefits of both CDR and SRM, it's very important that we are clear about the counterfactual situation. It's clear that both CDR and SRM pose high risks, but the question is always high risk compared to what? Is it high risk compared to a world that addresses mitigation smoothly and efficiently in a way that sadly does not correspond to our current reality? Or is it high risk compared to not deploying those options? And so I think both perspectives are valid and they have different roles in conversations, but it will help us to be always clear risks compared to what in our conversations and in developing governance mechanisms to address them. I've talked for long enough. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you to our two keynote speakers who have provided a scientific basis for the following panel discussion. I now would like to hand over to Mr. Janos Pasztor, who is the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. He will moderate the panel session and the Q&A. Janos.
Thank you very much, Chi, and thank you for the speakers before me. I think they made the situation very clear and give us a very good context for the discussion that will follow. Just a word to say that the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, our mission is to encourage these kinds of conversations in an impartial manner. That's what we do. So this event here is one of those events that we encourage to take place. And the context has been very clear. We're heading for an overshoot of some kind, and we need to do certain things to both limit the risks of overshoot, i.e. reduce the magnitude and the length of time, but we also need to manage the risk from the overshoot, that is the impacts that might happen once we pass the 1.5 degrees. And let's be clear, 1.5 is a certain politically agreed level, but at 1.2 degrees, which we have today, we already have plenty of impacts that need to be addressed. So this is where we are, and this is the context in which we have asked the panelists to address 3 questions. And the first question that we asked them is to look at what is the role of carbon dioxide removal in the region of the Asia Pacific, and how to reach the Paris Agreement goals, but also within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, because we don't want to forget about that either. And what are the related governance challenges? The second question is, how is this Asia Pacific region getting ready to manage the risks that we were talking about? And what is the potential role of UNESCAP in helping that process along? And the third question is, what is the role of regional actors, which includes UNESCAP, but maybe others as well, to build capacity, to build support capabilities for addressing these issues, including how to scale up CDR and potentially to explore solar radiation modification as part of the overall package. So this is the 3 questions, and we have 3 excellent panelists to follow the keynote speeches. And first, I would like to ask Shinichiro Asayama, senior researcher at the National Institute for Environmental Studies from Japan. After that, we'll have Neth Danyo, who is the Asia Director of the Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration, the ETC group. She's online, connecting from Chiang Mai. And Ambassador Ajay Malhotra, who is a distinguished fellow and senior advisor on climate change to TERI. And so these will be our 3 speakers. And then after that, when they address these issues, I've asked them to speak 3 to 5 minutes on these issues. Then we will have a discussion of the people who spoke. Kaveh, you're welcome to join, and also others who are online. So we will do that. And then there will be opportunities to ask questions both here in the room, but also people online. For those who are online, please leave your questions on the Q&A tab of the Zoom function, and then we'll try to deal with them one by one. So with that, let's go, and Dr. Asayama, if you could start with your remarks, please.
Thank you, Janos. Thank you. Anyways, first of all, thank you, the C2G and TERI, for inviting me to this event, and I'm very happy to be part of that with other the panelists, and also the thanks for your distinguished audiences participating in person, also the battery. So I like to give my 2 cents on regarding the questions what the Janos raised. And first of all, I like to point it out what is the role of the CDR in the Asia Pacific. And then I think it's first of all, I wanted to say it must be stressed that the role of the Asia Pacific is very, very important, not only in terms of managing risk of the global overshoot, but also more broadly in terms of the global climate governance. And then this is because of multiple reasons, but I will suggest there's 3 specific reasons there. And first of all, and as we know, Asia is the most populous region in the world, and with growing, rapidly growing economies. So many of the future actually GHG emissions and CO2 emissions will come from Asia, not from the North America, not from the Europe. So the Asia has a huge, and then challenges how to, mitigate and quickly. So I think it is important to understand the context. Is actually there's a challenge of actually achieving the Paris climate targets or achieving net zero target. It's basically about how quickly and how radically the Asia economy can decarbonize. And then also this is also quite challenging question. Is because the Asia is also Asian economy is also a lot of dependent on heavy industries, whose emissions are very difficult to eliminate directly at the sources, as Andy pointed out, there's a lot of like residual hard to abate like emissions. One of the example is like steel and iron and steel industries. 80%, more than nearly 80% of iron steel is produced in Asia, and more specifically in the 4 countries: China, India, Japan, and South Korea. And those like in the production of steel and iron steel production is very hard to eliminate. And how to achieve that, we need a CDR to compensate those related emissions. And also, so Asia economy needs the CDR to achieve net zero. But also, it is important to understand that Asia alone cannot achieve net zero by its own, because it's a huge, a lot of like the residual emissions coming from like Asian and these industries, and many of actually the IM modeling research suggesting in a scenario achieving net zero global net zero CO2 emissions by 2050s, Asia has a lot of like residual emissions which will be compensated and by the CDR in other regions, probably like Latin America and other countries. So this would suggest Asia, for Asia Pacific achieving net zero, they need a like de facto by nature we need a lot of like international corporations achieving net zero. And so this is in some way the reality what we are facing now. And whether we are actually facing the possibility of overshoot or not, this is a reality. And then, so we need to have actually very urgent political discussion about how to deliver the CDR in Asia Pacific. So that was the first reasons. And then second reason why the Asia Pacific is important for, particularly in the context of the overshoot, is because, as many other people already pointed out, this is a region also that many of the vulnerable community lives and suffering the damage of climate change, and like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Philippines, name a few. And so in some sense, and then Asia Pacific is as the it's a little bit like controversial to say, but it's Asia Pacific. It's both the victims and victimizer at the same time. I know it's a bit of controversial to say, but so the Asia Pacific as the front line, and both in terms of mitigation and adaptations. However, and this is the third reason I think is important, and we have to be very careful to remember that Asia Pacific is very diverse and very heterogeneous, and culturally, socially, and economically, and of course politically, and also in terms of the impacts of climate change. Many of the Asian Pacific countries suffer from impacts. It should not be equated to the, like, for instance, Japan, and then the developed countries, and then one of the largest CO2 greenhouse meters, and also only the G7 member from the Asia. So Japan has a much higher responsibility addressing climate change, and then should not be equated to the other countries. So these differences is very important to understand. Then question comes down, so what, how the internal politics within Asia Pacific. And I think the comparison to this Europe is in some way, I think, it's helpful to understand. And unlike Europe, we don't have Asia Pacific doesn't have a supranational institution like the European Union, which could coordinate different interests among countries and set a common goal for the regions. And of course, the Asia ASEAN and ASEAN should probably play a more active role in bringing neighboring countries together. But I think more fundamental question is what will bring the Asia Pacific countries together? In Europe, EU was created to avoid another war in Europe. And it's built on a common path, like European values, like human rights or freedom expressions. And perhaps my sense is this is not be the case for the Asia Pacific. I think rather than the common values, I think it's a common problem and common challenge probably would bring unite very heterogeneous Asia Pacific countries. And I think the climate change could be one of the way to unifying forces. And we should put the CDR in the context of the conversation how the Asia Pacific can work together as within as a common challenge. So the second point of regarding the third the questions about a lot of CDR, Asia Pacific and SRM, I want to give like a little bit of my thought, and I think I think the role of the Asia Pacific and SRM debates, it's a bit of ambiguous and then unclear what they can do. And first of all, I think the currently it is very unlikely any Asia Pacific countries will start researching or developing like the SRM technologies by themselves. And so from a technological point of view, I cannot see any like possible future scenario which like Asia Pacific will play a very active role and developing and deploying CDR SRM technologies, except to China. And this is probably partly true for the Europe as well. And Europe, in some way, they were actually the initiator of the global SRM debates, and it started the global debate. But now they shift the agenda. They are more focusing on CDR and net zero, and it seems like a little bit like putting the SRM option aside, at this moment. And also like so. I think if I imagine the future scenario that what the role of the European Union, Europe in an SRM debates, I don't think like Europe will like initiate the technology developments. That are actually that they are more kind of very cautious approach and taking cautious approach. And one example is I think last year the small group of social scientists from Europe and particularly from Netherlands, they started a campaign called the non-use agreements on solar geoengineering. So basically proposing the global moratorium of SRM research and developments. And I think this probably would likely be the position taken by the European Unions and other European countries. And then, but I think when we think about the future of this SRM debate, we can't rule out like a lot of the two big nations in the world, and US and China. And technically speaking, these are two countries most capable to use the SRM if they wanted to. And also the geopolitically, we cannot do we cannot have the meaningful discussions about SRM without them. And then so the question is, how would this rivalry relationship between US and China will characterize the nature of the SRM debates? Will two countries will compete each other's developing technologies, or do they incorporate each other's? And I think the both scenario is plausible. And my guess is Europe will come into the middle of this debate and try to open up more democratic and inclusive conversations. Then what about and this is in some way how the Europe will engage in international politics through building norms and international norms. Then what about the Asia Pacific? What the role of the Asia Pacific can play? And Asia Pacific at the heart of the geopolitical tension between US and China. We are geographically located in the middle of them. And then I think the SRM will be part of this geopolitical tension between US and China. So I think the Asia Pacific has a very important role, not because Asia Pacific country has interest in developing technologies, but because the Asia Pacific is a center of the geopolitical tension between the US and China. And I think we need to think about what the Asia Pacific countries can play, not escalating the tension between US and China, but how to have more dialogue and constructive discussions. So, and that's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much. We are running a little bit behind time. There is an inflationary problem here, so I'd like to ask that we try to not be too long in our comments, because we do have to finish before 2 o'clock. Because there's something else happening here. So with that, I would like to ask now our next speaker, Net Daniel from the ETC, to join us online. And please, Nat, share with us.
I'm here, Janos. Yeah, I will try to be short, but I don't think I can do this in 5 minutes. 6 minutes maybe. Sorry. Okay. It's thank you for inviting me to be in this panel, and happy to meet old and new faces online, and also online. I'm not there in person. I'd like to say at the outset that overshoot should not be seen as inevitable nor as a default framing in any multilateral discussions that aim to address the challenges posed by the climate chaos, the climate crisis, and the environmental crisis. All efforts should focus in avoiding an overshoot, yes, keeping the global average temperature below 1.5 C as committed by the international community. Serious mitigation and adaptation efforts must focus on ensuring deep emission cuts as part of the commitment of the global north, and supporting proven and tested approaches that would not aggravate the multiple crises in biodiversity, environment, and climate change, and would not exacerbate inequalities in power and wealth between the north and south and within countries. Any decision to look into CDR and SRM as options for addressing the climate crisis, whether or not that's within overshoot discussions, is a political decision. A desperate move that reeks of acceptance of defeat, as Kaveh pointed out in his opening. Choosing to believe promises and illusions that technological fixes such as geoengineering, SRM and CDM, SRM and CDR can save us from the road to hell over deep cuts in emissions and economy-wide transformation, because techno fixes are cheaper than this transformation, and also less politically costly, and also choosing these options over proven and tested approaches and technologies from the bottom up, such as agroecology, renewables, etc., is a political decision that should involve accountability to peoples. CDR, in order to be relevant in policymaking, should not gloss over what scale are we talking about that would make any impact at all on reducing warming, in stabilizing the climate. CDR is not scale neutral, never scale neutral. The scale of deployment, including outdoor experiments of CDR, would have implications on the environment, people's livelihoods, diplomacy, conflict, etc. The impacts of CDR, even more so of SRM, on the environment, biodiversity, land use, food security, food sovereignty, livelihoods, and communities should be front and center in any decision that would lead us to the root of geoengineering in any country. Many of these impacts are transboundary by nature. We have a number of examples from the region. For example, the Sulusi ocean fertilization experiment in 2007-2008, which actually straddles between Malaysia and the Philippines. And that was a rogue experiment by scientists from the University of Sydney that was squashed by the Philippine government, raised to the CBD, that led to the adoption of the moratorium on ocean fertilization under the Convention on Biodiversity, just to cite an example. Governance is a fundamental discussion in both CDR and SRM. Who decides how that governance would look like, and how that will allow or enable involvement of people in general, and especially potentially impacted communities? Assumptions that governance of CDR is adequately covered by the UNFCCC need to be interrogated, because that is really flawed. At the regional level, questions like, do existing governance mechanisms already exist in Asia Pacific to deal with transboundary impacts of large-scale CDR? Would existing governance mechanisms or structures work, like the ASEAN mechanism that was put in motion during the severe haze episodes 15 years ago? Are there existing and future governance mechanisms linked at all to the overall adaptation and mitigation approaches that actually straddles among departments, between agencies in any national bureaucracy, or even within the bureaucracy of ASEAN in Southeast Asia, or the bureaucracy of ESCAP in that level where Kaveh is? Do they at all take into account and respect outstanding commitments of countries in the region in other multilateral agreements, such as the CBD and the London Convention, London Protocol on Ocean Dumping, which actually have outstanding moratorium on ocean fertilization and climate geoengineering as a whole? On SRM, and this may be true as well in some CDR technologies, there are serious concerns that go beyond the sphere of climate and environment in which these discourses are mostly happening, such as the security implications on fragile relationship between some states that could exacerbate conflicts, such as in the case of India and Pakistan, if any of them would decide to go take SRM as an option, as that fiction delved in, the Ministry of the Future delved in. I'm sure the ambassador has read that. And that could also exacerbate other conflicts, existing conflicts over hydrological management in the region, such as the Mekong countries, the Indochina area. Discussions and decisions on benefits need to happen within the region and must involve people in the region, informed by science-based evidence and experiences of people, and taking into account the concrete realities in the region. Risk analysis as a lens in considering SRM and CDR as an option is not a given and should not be imposed on the region and its people who are already currently and severely impacted by the adverse impacts of climate change. It is easy for those whose houses and livelihoods are not inundated by severe flooding year after year to say that not doing anything or status quo is more risky than taking desperate measures such as geoengineering. All of the above points apply to both CDR and SRM in general, but more deeply political and has regional and strategic dimensions, and strategic dimensions for SRM because of the inherent risk involved, the unequal impacts, which was mentioned by our IPCC colleague, termination shock, and the dangers of unilateral deployment. Governance framework for SRM requires more than what are needed for adaptation and mitigation actions that may or may include CDR, in view of the nature and inherent risk involved that go far beyond the existing governance framework around climate change in most countries. SRM would have unequal and uneven impacts, which may be true for some CDR technologies as well, and the scale needed to have that it needs to have any impact in stabilizing the temperature. Lastly, who bears the cost and will be accountable for the damages, increased risk, unforeseen consequences of geoengineering, of CDR and SRM? Who will pay? Is it going to be the companies that develop and deploy these technologies? Is it going to be the governments on the table who make the decision? Is it going to be the UN who will pay? What price tag are we going to put on those who will end up as losers in the unequal game involved in SRM? So I'd like to end my presentation there. Sorry for taking up more than 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Neth, and very much appreciate these thoughts. And now we have our last intervention, Ambassador Ajay Malhotra, please.
Thank you, Janos. I think very little remains to be said, so I'll try and bring out the issues that I believe need to be brought out. First of all, it's fair to say that the outcome of the just concluded COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh on carbon emissions has been less than satisfactory. It is increasingly clear that 1.5 degrees centigrade cap will not be abided by. Even 2 degrees centigrade looks suspect. And if you recall the 1.5 degrees special report from 2018, we used to talk about, at one stage, halving carbon emissions by 2030. In my view, the SDGs are unlikely to be met by 2030. We will have to see, like the MDGs became SDGs, we'll have to look at something else as we go forward. But now we have shifted to developed countries talking only about net zero emissions by 2050 and a differentiation given or taken by developing countries who do so by 2060 or 2070. So the ball has been kicked forward for now. The scenarios that we have, the overshoot scenario that we are all referring to, there are certain technologies that have been developed. Some of them are a little suspect, but we need to look at them in terms of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, and solar radiation modification. We need to look at them separately. These, in terms of the risks associated, in terms of what they can do, and in terms of the stage of development of technologies, are a little different. Here I want to make a point. I agree with Neth Daniel that we must work as far as possible to avoid overshoot, and reducing CO2 and GHG emissions is the best way to proceed. So let's not let's hold the developed countries' toes to the fire. There are responsibilities out there, historical and other and present, and we should not forget that, because it's easy to say, oh, there's some new technologies and our part is done. Coming to ESCAP and your questions, ESCAP is a vast and diverse region from a socioeconomic, a carbon emission, environmental viewpoint. It has 53 members, and all major countries are covered, including China, India, USA. You have UK, France, Russia. You also have the rich, the small islands, the LDCs. But more than that, you have many that are highly vulnerable. So we have to look at their concerns. I think as ESCAP, some focus needs to be given on that. When we look at CDR, I don't see it being implemented beyond in a supportive role at the moment in terms of its outcome. Right now, carbon dioxide removal has not acquired the sort of commercial and political acceptance that would allow it to be implemented in a large-scale manner, however you might define large-scale, which is quite unclear. So as a result, its impact would be marginal. I don't believe it would be decisive. And we should not lose our focus on GHG emissions. I heard from Andy that, and that is reflected in the 3 working group reports on the 6th assessment of IPCC, that CDR is probably unavoidable. But yes, we need to think how we can use it in an ESCAP context in partnership sense, because of all the countries being present, so that we can be supportive of each other rather than being confrontational. So especially when all the IPCC mitigation pathways now rely on it, because this wasn't the position earlier. First it was 1, then it was 5, now everything kind of imagines that you have to do CDR. Looking at SRM, solar radiation management, which is a different kettle of fish, clearly it arouses controversy, and due to the huge risks and concerns associated with it, its potential impact on crops, biodiversity, and we keep looking at climate. We must look beyond it. There are things, not only weather modification, it is ecosystems, biodiversity, different life forms, all are going to be affected. So let's not only look at it in a climate, from a climate angle. The impact will be certainly unequal, it will be uneven, it may well prove harmful to some regions and communities, especially in the global south, who are ill-prepared in any case to tackle, to handle the burden of climate change that has devolved on them. So it is, in my view, eminently desirable that we have developed gradually, and one should not be prescriptive, develop gradually some sort of governance matrix, put it in place, because at present this is non-existent whatsoever. And when you look at SRM, as again Daniel said, who will bear the costs and the damages of unforeseen consequences, which could be many. I agree with one point made by Shinichiro, that in particular, many points, but in particular one, that USA and China may well be at the forefront of action on SRM, and we need to keep a watch on that, because sometimes they do pile up together and bring out proposals. And that has its own element of danger that needs to be focused on. So as to ESCAP, I think it would be good to have ESCAP actively participate in these sort of discussions. Enhanced leadership by ESCAP in terms of how to approach solar radiation modification would be useful. Particularly, I would say we should welcome it in education and information dissemination and capacity building. At the present, we are at a very early stage of doing things. So I do believe, especially with the mix and match of the 53 countries in ESCAP, that ESCAP should take a enhanced leadership role out here. I could stop there if you want.
Well, thank you very much. This has been fantastic and lots of useful information. At the technical level, we have to wrap this up in 4 minutes. officially, but I think we can go a few minutes beyond that, but not much more because there is another event here. So I'd like to ask quickly if you have any questions, please raise your hand, both in the meeting room here and also colleagues online. If you have any questions, please put it on the Q&A and tab of the Zoom functionality, and we can try to deal with one or two questions. I see there are two already, so the gentleman here, please go ahead. And then next,
I am.
Please introduce yourself so we know who you are.
Sang-Min Nam, I'm Director of Environmental Development and of ESCAP. So let me give you some numbers. Like for our long-term low emission development strategies of our member state, like Cambodia is planning to increase their carbon absorption capacity by 50 million tons per year. In Thailand, 120 million tons. Like Indonesia, 350 million tons. And then current CDR, especially DAC, is the total capacity is about 10,000 tons, combined 18, 19 plants. So, I mean, my fundamental question is whether we can have a sufficient capacity, enough capacity that can make a meaningful impact. That's one. Considering the plan of many of our member states based on nature conservation, nature-based solutions. And I see really the point from the investor separating the topic of CDR and then SRM. I see it's also, I mean, in terms of risk involved, in terms of political implication and cost, maybe it would be good to separate them and then have a different track of discussion. So, but when it comes to the role of ESCAP, also especially this division working on climate change, there are many urgent issues that countries have to address. So whether it is a really topic for many of our member states to engage dialogue and to develop the process. So, I mean, to me, really priority is really focus on capacity building for their nature-based solution since they have already concrete plans, so how to really implement that plan. So that is my observation and comments.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to go on to the next question, and I'd like to ask the speakers to think about the potential response at the end. You'll get a chance to address some questions. So please, Oleg.
Thank you, Janos. I do understand the time constraint that actually I have one quick comment or kind of expression of opinion and quick question to one of the panelists. My name is Oleg Shimanov. I'm actually the DPR to the UNESCAP and I'm head of the Division for Environment and Sustainable Development. And I also participated in climate negotiations as well as many other negotiations on environment and sustainable development. That said, quick comment. I have to say that I was really pleased to hear from the Shinichiro-san saying that climate change might be one of the unifying forces, I quote. And that's what I could concur fully with. And I have always been strong believer in that. What I wanted to say that unfortunately it is still not the case. This is a very regrettable. And I'm referring to what our distinguished colleague, Ambassador Malhotraji said, that honestly, I was not very happy to hear about that, that we have those responsible for climate change and we have to have that on the forefront. I do understand that, but that will not bring us closer to the real solution to the problem. That's why I believe we need to forge what I was saying at the committee meeting. Climate was also on my mind, that we have to think about refurbishing the mentality of the policy elites back home so that we could join hands and act together. Despite this CBDR, which we clearly understand the specificity, still we need common actions because we live on the earth. That is my emphatical comment. And then quick question actually to one of the panelists. And I have to say, Janos, my dear friend, actually for many years from the past history of our relationship, that I see a real value in those kind of events where the table brings together the experts from the scientific community and those dealing with the international diplomacy and international relations. The scientific view and science-based approach is very important for the politicians to arrive to sober-minded decisions. That always was a question, and it has never been yet that we fully succeeded in achieving this consensus actually being forged. My question to Andy Reisinger, if he's still there behind the screen, if you could actually say a few words or describe the CDR which you've been talking about, and the risks of wide-scale deployment of CDR, even answering in the format of answers for dummies, you could explain those risks and also add if there have been any feasibility study of economic costs for CDR, either at the global level or specifically for Asian Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what I would like to suggest now, given the time that we really have to wrap up in a couple of minutes, I would like to ask each one of our speakers, both here on the table and online, to try to address one of the issues raised, or maybe two, but you don't go beyond a minute each, because we really have to get out of this room. So starting Kaveh, okay, then Ajay, please.
Well, first of all, just to say I entirely agree. We need a science-based approach, and that is the only approach. That is in terms of what needs to be done. And then we need to look at who has the money to tackle it and who has the technologies to tackle it, and how are they going to share that. If they provide it to us, we have been asking for clean coal technologies for a long time. But if it were available, we'll happily take it on. You give it to us, we'll go at your pace. There's no problem there at all. We must have a common approach. I entirely endorse that also. And just to point out that we must also, especially for SRM, we must have a coordinated approach to it, because there are high risks. I think Andy pointed that out. High risks from unilateral deployment, given their transboundary impacts. So we must have a cooperation and consultation before doing anything, rather than doing something and then have confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you. Shin?
Thank you. So just want to thank you for your comments, and I definitely agree. And I think it is not yet like climate change become the unifying force. But I just said, just want to say, yeah. But I think that there is a risk climate change can be the dividing force as well, and in Asia Pacific, but not. I think we need to, that's the risk we have to aware of it, and then we need to actually reframe the climate change. It should be like, be framed as the unifying force. So thank you for coming. I just want to say, repeat my points. I think this should be like a unifying force. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nat, could you please, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, just very quickly, I would really encourage ESCAP to promote more discussions like this involving those who are outside of the science experts sphere, and also governments. Like ESCAP has actually laid out a number of mechanisms involving people's constituencies and stakeholders that whose voices and views should be counted equally in conversations moving forward on SRM and CDR. So just that.
Thank you very much. Andy?
Thanks, Janos. One point, I strongly support the treating CDR and SRM differently. I don't think we're helping the conversation by lumping them into the same basket. I think there's the call for differentiated approaches. The question, most of the CDR risks relate to the land demand of some CDR options. So whether that's afforestation or the production of biomass for use in bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage. So that's where most of the risks discussed in literature come from. But of course, also, as I mentioned, the risk of reversal and the liabilities that would arise from relying on biological carbon storage. And maybe if I can get a last sentence in, I think nature-based solutions were mentioned. It is really important to think through co-benefits and how to utilize those. And then by pointing out the carbon dioxide removal processes, tap into climate finance, as well as the local co-benefits for ecosystems, for productive agriculture, etc. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And given the time, I would love to address many of the issues that were raised here. I won't, because we do have to leave. But maybe I'd just like to, first of all, thank all the speakers. Thank you for the participants. And I think I'd like to leave with just one thought, which has come up both in terms of comments and is this question of, can climate change, addressing the climate crisis, be a unifying force in today's world? It's a question that we raised. We haven't really answered it. And I would like to say that let's make that happen somehow. And maybe that's the way to move forward. So thank you very much. And we look forward to further conversations on this issue here and elsewhere. And if there's anything else, we can still talk outside the room, but I think we need to leave. Thank you very much, everybody.